I'm Sergeant Amber Cox, 32 years old, an intelligence analyst for the United States Army. My job is to live in the shadows, to bring the truth to light. After 96 straight hours without sleep to map out an ambush that saved an entire platoon, I had to sit in silence and listen to Captain Cadence Thorne, a general's son, take all the credit. In front of the entire command staff, he turned to me, exhausted and depleted, and said with a condescending smile, "Thanks for the data entry support, Sergeant. Very efficient." The room erupted in applause for him. But Cadence didn't know his arrogance was a fatal flaw, and he was about to walk right into a trap I had set for him. If you've ever given your all just to be pushed aside by someone else, give me a like, let me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe. Because sometimes justice isn't given to you. It has to be taken. The applause finally died, replaced by the hollow scrape of chairs against the linoleum floor and the murmur of empty congratulations. The men filed out of the briefing room at Fort Meade, patting Captain Thorne on the back, their faces reflecting the easy glow of a victory they hadn't earned. I remained at my seat in the corner, a ghost in a room suddenly too large, too quiet. The air was stale with the lingering smell of burnt coffee and ozone from the printers. It was the scent of a long, thankless night. Sergeant Hex Jimenez, our cyber operations specialist, walked past my table. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just placed a can of Dr. Pepper beside my motionless hand, the gesture a silent acknowledgement. The can was cold, sweating condensation onto the polished wood, and the chill seeped into my skin. But it was nothing compared to the ice forming in my chest. I stared at the massive projector screen, now dark and blank. Just minutes ago, it had been filled with my work. Heat maps, signal intercepts, link analysis charts, a complex web of intelligence I had woven from sleeplessness and caffeine. 96 hours of my life, distilled into a presentation that saved 30 souls, now attributed to another man. Data entry support. The two words echoed in the silence, replaying in my mind. They weren't just an insult, they were an erasure. It wasn't just credit he had stolen, it was my very existence in the operation. He had reduced my mind, my intuition, my years of training to the mechanical function of a keyboard. In his world, a world greased by his father's legacy, I wasn't a strategist. I was equipment. My father, a retired steelworker from Pennsylvania, used to tell me stories about the mills. "The best steel has to go through the hottest fire, Amber," he'd say, his hands calloused and strong. "Don't you ever be afraid of the pressure, girl. You let it temper you." I felt that fire now, a white-hot rage burning away the shock, leaving something hard and sharp in its place. The door swung open, tearing through the quiet. Cadence strode back in, his face flushed with unearned triumph. He carried himself with the frictionless ease of a man who had never encountered a real obstacle in his life. He didn't just walk, he occupied space, assuming it was his for the taking. "Cox," he said, his voice sharp with authority. He tossed a thick binder onto my desk. The sound of it slapping against the wood was like a gunshot in the silent room. "Operation Nightfall. I need full administrative access to Project Chimera. Now." Project Chimera. He said the name with such casual ownership, as if he were asking for a notepad. Chimera was my baby. I had built it from scratch over 18 months, coding the analytical framework myself, creating a system that could see patterns in the noise that no one else could. It was more than a project. It was an extension of my own mind. And he was demanding the keys. Not asking. Demanding. His eyes, a pale, forgettable blue, flickered over me for a fraction of a second before dismissing me. There was no respect in that glance, not even professional courtesy. There was only the expectation of immediate compliance, the look of a master to a tool. The vulture had finished with the kill and was now coming back to pick the bones clean. I took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the tremor from my hands, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Captain, granting full administrative access to Chimera's raw data without the proper analytical context is extremely dangerous. It could lead to fatal misinterpretations." I was trying to save him from himself. I was trying to protect the soldiers in the field from his lethal combination of arrogance and incompetence. I was still, even then, doing my job. A smirk curled his lip. It wasn't a smile, it was a display of power. He let out a short, condescending laugh that made my skin crawl. Sergeant, I think I know how to read a report. Your job is to follow orders, not to think. Don't make me report this. Insubordination. The threat was wrapped in the silk of his privilege, a weapon he had wielded his entire career. He thought it was his trump card, the phrase that always made people like me fall in line. He was wrong. I looked straight into his eyes, and in that moment, the rage inside me cooled, solidifying into something new, something cold and clear. I saw him for what he truly was, a hollow uniform propped up by a powerful name, an empty vessel, loud with the echo of his own self-importance. His arrogance wasn't just a character flaw, it was a tactical weakness, a vulnerability. And he had just handed me the master key to exploit it. My silence stretched. It was no longer the silence of shock or submission. It was the silence of calculation. The silence of a predator that has just spotted its prey's fatal mistake. The silence of steel being quenched. When I finally spoke, my voice was unnervingly calm. Quiet. Level. Yes, Captain. You'll have your access. A triumphant smile spread across his face. He thought he had won. He gave a sharp, satisfied nod and turned, walking out of the room without a backward glance. He had no idea that he hadn't just won a minor skirmish. He had just triggered a mine of his own making. The silent, undeclared war had officially begun. Sleep never came that night. The quiet of my small apartment in Laurel, Maryland was a heavy blanket, pressing down with the weight of that final, cold nod I'd given Cadence. The access was granted. The first move in a war he didn't even know he was fighting had been made. To understand that move, to understand the steel that was hardening in my spine, you'd have to look at the map of scars that led me here. I got up from my bed and went to the kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath my feet. I went through a familiar ritual, a small act of control from my college days. I filled the kettle, measured out 2 scoops of loose-leaf Earl Grey, and let the scent of bergamot fill the air as the water boiled. It was my way of bracing myself. With a steaming mug in hand, I sat by the window, watching the distant glow of cars on the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. And in the darkness, the ghosts of my past came visiting. The first ghost wore the crisp uniform of the Intelligence Academy. I remembered graduation day, the pride swelling in my chest. I had finished at the top of my class. Top scores in cryptography, signals analysis, human intelligence theory, every single metric. During the final review, my instructor, a seasoned colonel with kind eyes, slid my evaluation across the desk. I scanned it eagerly, searching for the validation I'd worked so hard for. And I found it, twisted into a backhanded compliment. While my male counterparts were praised for their strategic thinking and innate leadership instincts, my report lauded me as exceptionally effective in a support role. The final damning sentence was burned into my memory. Lacks the requisite assertiveness for a command position. Support role. Assertiveness. They were code words, polite ways of saying good worker, but not a leader. They were the words that built the box they put me in. The label was applied before my career had even begun. I wasn't a weapon to be wielded. I was a sharp, useful tool, meant to be kept in the toolbox until a man decided he needed it. That piece of paper became a ghost that followed me, whispering in the ears of my superiors, defining me before I could define myself. The next ghost was larger, smelling of sand and adrenaline. It took me back 2 years, to Operation Iron Gauntlet. We were tracking a high-value target in a volatile region, and the consensus among the senior analysts was to approve a major offensive. But something felt wrong. I saw a ghost in the machine, a subtle, anomalous flutter in the enemy's communication patterns that everyone else had dismissed as background noise. To me, it wasn't noise, it was a symphony of deception. I spent 3 straight nights fueled by vending machine coffee and sheer obsession, cross-referencing satellite imagery and old intel until I had built an undeniable case. Our planned attack route wasn't a path to victory, It was the direct line into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. I brought my report, thick with evidence, to my commanding officer at the time, a major on the brink of retirement, more interested in his pension than in rocking the boat. He glanced at the cover page, scanned a single paragraph, and pushed it back towards me with a dismissive wave. "Too speculative, Sergeant," he sighed, as if my diligence was an inconvenience. The institutional inertia was too strong. The plan was already in motion. I was faced with a choice: follow protocol and watch a convoy of good soldiers roll into a kill box, or risk my career. I chose my career. I broke chain of command and sent my report through a back channel, a secure but unsanctioned network, to a friend in the forward operating base, a Marine captain who trusted my instincts. He read it, he saw what I saw, and he rerouted the convoy with less than an hour to spare. Dozens of lives were saved that day. The official result? The major received a commendation for his cautious oversight. I received an informal but very serious reprimand for procedural violations. I was punished for being right. I learned a bitter lesson. In the U.S. Army, sometimes the truth is secondary to the chain of command. I took a long sip of my tea, the heat a small comfort against the chill of the final, most painful memory. This ghost didn't wear a uniform. It was dressed for Thanksgiving dinner back home in Pennsylvania. It was my one trip home in 2 years, and my dad, a proud Army veteran himself, was beaming, telling all our relatives how his daughter was working on top-secret stuff for the government. The pride in his voice was a warm blanket. Then my uncle, a man who sold insurance, leaned forward, a half-eaten drumstick in his hand. "So, you're an officer then, Amber?" he asked. "No, Uncle Jim," I said with a polite smile. "I'm a sergeant." He chuckled, a wheezing sound, and slapped my father's shoulder. "Hey, that's all right, Tom. At least she's serving. My son, Mark, he just made regional manager." And just like that, in the warm, gravy-scented air of my childhood home, my world shrank. All the sleepless nights, the immense pressure, the life and death stakes of my work, all of it was weighed against regional manager and found wanting. I wasn't an officer, I wasn't a leader. In a simple civilian calculus, I was just a grunt, a worker bee, not someone in charge. The casual dismissal from my own family cut deeper than any professional slight. I stood up and walked to the window, leaving the ghost behind in the kitchen. I looked out over the sleeping suburbs, the distant lights of Baltimore a faint smudge on the horizon. These memories, these cuts, these dismissals, they were a map of scars I carried. But looking at them now, I realized they no longer ached with the sting of injustice. They had become something else. They had been forged into armor. Cadence. He wasn't the first to underestimate me, to try and put me in a box labeled support. But as I stood there, watching the world sleep, I made a silent vow. He would be the last. He thought he was using a tool. In reality, he was stepping onto a battlefield of my own making, a landscape shaped by every scar I had ever received. And on this battlefield, I knew every inch of the terrain. I walked over to my bookshelf and pulled out my worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. I opened it to a passage I'd underlined years ago. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. It wasn't about destroying Cadence. It was about refusing to be like him. It was about integrity. This time there would be no silence. There would only be the truth. I was in the office before sunrise the next day. The emotional turmoil of the night had receded, leaving behind a state of hyper-focused clarity. The anger was still there, but it was no longer a storm. It was the core of a furnace, fueling a calm, meticulous energy. I sat down at my station, the triple monitors humming to life in the pre-dawn gloom, and I began my work. I was going to build a weapon. Not out of steel or explosives, but out of data. The story of David and Goliath always resonated with me. I didn't have a slingshot or a stone, but in the 21st century, a well-placed piece of information is far more devastating. Data was my stone. My trap for Cadence couldn't be a simple lie. Feeding him fabricated intelligence would be amateurish, easily detected by even a cursory system audit. No, my weapon had to be far more elegant. It had to be built from the truth. I began by creating a partitioned subdirectory within Project Chimera's main architecture. I labeled it Red Cell Analysis, Provisional. Red Cell is a term we use for teams that play the role of the enemy to test our own strategies. The name itself implied a certain level of aggressive, out-of-the-box thinking, exactly the kind of thing that would appeal to Cadence's ego. Inside this curated garden of data, I planted my seeds. I populated the folder with legitimate, verified intelligence reports, satellite photos, and signal intercepts. Everything was real, but I meticulously pruned the context. It was an exercise in the analysis of competing hypotheses, a method we're taught to use to avoid cognitive bias. I was using it in reverse. I was intentionally creating a cognitive bias. I took out the reports that offered conflicting interpretations. I buried the footnotes that questioned the reliability of a source. I left a trail of perfectly factual breadcrumbs that led to only one possible conclusion: a bold, brilliant, and utterly fatal hypothesis. It was a beautiful lie, constructed entirely from the truth. A trap designed not for a fool, but specifically for a lazy, arrogant man in a hurry to be a hero. I knew my target. Cadence Thorne would never do the grunt work. He wouldn't spend hours in the digital trenches, cross-referencing raw data streams, or reading dissenting opinions. He saw himself as a grand strategist, a man who operated on the 30,000-foot level. He would look for the executive summary, the boldest plan, the quickest path to a medal. And I had built it for him. The narrative I crafted within the Red Cell folder painted a picture of a critical enemy vulnerability, a communications hub that, if hit with a swift surgical strike, would cripple their entire regional network. On the surface, the plan was flawless. It was audacious. It promised a low-risk, high-reward victory that could be pinned to a single officer's brilliant insight. It was everything Cadence wanted to hear, a siren song for his ambition. The reality, which the full, unpruned data set in the main Chimera directory clearly showed, was that the communications hub was a decoy. It was a heavily fortified honeypot designed to lure our forces into a devastating kill box, the very ambush I had just saved a platoon from, repackaged and presented as an opportunity. The next step was to create the evidence of his negligence. I embedded a simple logging script into the Red Cell directory, one that would ping my secure device with a silent alert every time the folder was accessed. It was my digital tripwire. The first alert came at 09:17 hours. Cadence Thorne, access, your Red Cell, provisional. I watched from my desk as he began his research. Another ping. Download, file, Red Cell, alpha.pdf. I checked the system logs. Time spent viewing the file, 15 seconds. It was a 12-page analysis. He hadn't read it, he had strip-mined it for buzzwords. Ping. Download, file, Red Cell, gamma.pdf. Time spent, 10 seconds. And then, the most crucial part. I watched the logs for the corresponding files in the main directory, the ones with the crucial context, the ones I had linked as required cross-reference. There was nothing. No access, no downloads. He was ignoring every warning sign, every red flag, swallowing the bait whole. He was so sure of his own brilliance that he never considered the information might be tailored for it. He was building his own prison, and I was just handing him the bricks, one time-stamped log file at a time. The very definition of data entry support. Late that afternoon, Hex ambled over to my desk, holding a tangled mess of blue wire. "Hey Amber, you got a spare Ethernet cable? This one's fried." It was a transparent excuse, a way to talk without being noticed. He leaned over my desk, ostensibly to look in my drawer, and lowered his voice to a near whisper. "I saw Thorne's draft for Nightfall," he murmured, his eyes scanning the room. "He's basing his entire assault plan on that Red Cell data. It looks dangerously optimistic. Some of his technical assumptions are damn near impossible." I stopped typing but didn't look up from my screen. I just said one word. "I know." Hex was quiet for a long moment. He was one of the smartest people in the building, a man who saw the world in code and logic. He knew data, and he knew when it was being misused. He straightened up, having miraculously found a cable in his hand that wasn't there before. Colonel Rostova is presiding over the final briefing, he said, his voice back to normal volume. He looked me straight in the eye. She's not someone who gets snowed by buzzwords. Be careful. His words hung in the air long after he had walked away. It wasn't just a warning. It was confirmation, an act of solidarity. I wasn't just some disgruntled sergeant acting on a vendetta. My assessment of the data, and of Cadence, was shared by one of the most respected technical minds on the base. His quiet validation was a shield. I finally looked up from my screen, a slow, confident smile touching my lips for the first time that day. I was not alone in this fight. The truth had another ally, and now it had a name: Colonel Rostova. The game board was set. The pieces were in motion. All I had to do was wait for the king to make his fatal move. Hex's mention of Colonel Eva Rostova shifted the entire dynamic of my plan. She was no longer just a name on an org chart. She was the decisive terrain upon which this battle would be fought. My trap was set for Cadence, but it was Rostova who would ultimately serve as judge, jury, and potentially executioner. My anxiety began to climb. She was a variable I couldn't control. Colonel Rostova was a living legend at Fort Meade. They called her the Ice Wall. It wasn't because she was cold or cruel, but because she was utterly impenetrable. You couldn't flatter her, you couldn't intimidate her, and you certainly couldn't bullshit her. She was a third-generation Army brat, raised on a series of military bases around the world, and it was said she understood the soul of the Army better than the Pentagon did. I had seen her in action during high-level threat briefings. While other officers would nod along to slick PowerPoint presentations filled with military buzzwords, Rostova would sit perfectly still, her piercing blue-gray eyes scanning every data point, every chart. She never interrupted. But when the presenter was finished, she would raise a hand, and the questions that followed were like surgical strikes. They were never accusatory, always calm. But they would invariably find the one fatal flaw in the logic, the one assumption that couldn't be supported. She could dismantle a weak argument in under a minute, leaving the presenter exposed and utterly defeated. She was a terror to the incompetent and the arrogant, which made her a silent, distant hope for people like me. Her reputation was built on small, consistent details. She drank her coffee black, no sugar, from a battered metal mug that supposedly dated back to her father's service during the Cold War. The folklore around the office was that she could spot a lie just from the way a man shifted his weight from one foot to the other. In my mind, I saw her less as a modern officer and more like a historical figure I'd studied at the academy, Queen Elizabeth Thornes, a ruler who survived and thrived by using patience and intelligence, listening to all her counselors but trusting only her own final judgment. My plan depended entirely on that judgment being as sharp as the legend claimed. A few days after my conversation with Hex, I had a chance encounter that felt like anything but chance. I was in the break room on our floor, nursing a cup of tea, trying to calm the nervous energy buzzing under my skin. The door opened and Colonel Rostova walked in. An immediate hush fell over the room. The two junior lieutenants who had been laughing by the coffee machine suddenly found urgent business with their phones. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of discipline. She walked straight to the industrial-grade coffee maker, poured a cup into that famous metal mug, and then turned. Her eyes met mine across the room. For a second, I felt like a bug under a microscope. Then she walked directly over to my table. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Sergeant Cox," she said. Her voice was low and even, with no discernible accent. It was the voice of command. "Ma'am," I managed, my own voice tight. "I read your analysis on the Korengal Valley incident," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "The original." She put a slight, deliberate emphasis on that last word. The original. Not the sanitized, official version that gave credit to the major who had ignored me, the one I had sent through the back channel. My breath caught in my throat. She knew. Somehow, she knew the whole story. "Thorough," she said. "Very thorough." That was it. She gave a single, sharp nod, turned, and walked out of the break room. The entire interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. She left me sitting there, my heart pounding, a whirlwind of thoughts in my mind. 3 words: the original. Very thorough. It was more than a compliment. It was a signal. It was recognition from the one person whose opinion mattered. It was a confirmation that someone in the vast grinding machinery of the military was capable of seeing through the political fog to the truth underneath. For the first time in a long time, I felt a fragile spark of hope. The next morning, the official email landed in my inbox. The subject line was stark. Preliminary briefing, Operation Nightfall. My stomach twisted. The meeting was scheduled for the following day to be presided over by Colonel Eva Rostova. Captain Cadence Thorne was listed as the lead presenter. It was happening. Round 1. My meticulously constructed trap was about to be tested. The hope I'd felt from our brief encounter was now battling a fresh wave of anxiety. Rostova's praise was one thing. Her reaction to a plan that was, on its surface, a work of strategic brilliance would be another. Would she see the elegant lie I had built? Or would she only see the incompetent captain who was presenting it? I spent the rest of the day preparing, not for a presentation of my own, but for the questions I anticipated Rostova would ask Cadence. I became my own red cell team, attacking his plan from every conceivable angle. I mapped out every flawed assumption, every piece of missing context, and I prepared the corresponding real data on a separate, secure file. I wasn't just going to let him walk into the trap. I was going to be ready to spring it the moment he stumbled. Just before leaving for the day, I walked past one of the small glass-walled conference rooms down the hall. I saw Cadence inside, pacing back and forth, his cell phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking in that loud, overconfident tone he used when he wanted to project authority. I paused in the shadows, just out of his line of sight. He was talking to his father. "No, Dad, don't worry. It's all under control," he was saying, a dismissive laugh in his voice. "Rostova can be tough, I hear, but this plan is airtight. There are no holes. I'm going to make you proud." The blood in my veins turned to ice. General Thorne wasn't just a shadow providing passive privilege. He was an active participant, a source of encouragement, and almost certainly a source of political pressure from above. This changed everything. This wasn't just my career against Cadence's. It was my word as a sergeant against the weight and power of a 2-star general and his golden boy son. The risk had just multiplied tenfold. My carefully constructed plan suddenly felt terrifyingly small. The strategic briefing room felt like a vacuum. It was a space designed to suck the air and sound out of a conversation, leaving only the weight of decision. A massive horseshoe-shaped oak table dominated the room, polished to a mirror shine. On the walls, a bank of giant screens displayed satellite maps and encrypted data streams in a silent, hypnotic dance. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the unspokens of rank and power. This was where careers were made or broken. I took my usual seat along the wall outside the horseshoe, a position that designated me as staff, not a principal. An observer, a ghost. Cadence stood at the head of the table, basking in the attention. He radiated a confidence that was almost comical in its intensity, a peacock displaying his borrowed plumes. He launched into his presentation of Operation Nightfall, and it was a masterful performance of saying absolutely everything and absolutely nothing at the same time. He wove a tapestry of military jargon, his voice resonating with false authority. He spoke of asymmetric dominance, of maximizing force multipliers, and seizing a strategic window of opportunity. It was a flawless recitation of all the phrases they teach you at West Point to sound impressive. I watched the faces around the table. A few of the younger captains were nodding along enthusiastically, their expressions a mixture of admiration and envy. They were captivated by the sheer force of his self-assurance. They saw a future general. I saw a hollow man playing a role. But my eyes, like a laser sight, were fixed on only one person, Colonel Eva Rostova. She sat directly opposite Cadence, perfectly still, her hands clasped on the table before her. Her face was an impassive mask, her eyes missing nothing. She didn't nod, she didn't take notes, she simply watched him. She was the ice wall, and Cadence's tidal wave of buzzwords was breaking harmlessly against her. When he finally finished his grand performance with a flourish, a pregnant silence filled the room. It was Rostova who broke it. "An ambitious plan, Captain Thorne," she said, her voice even and calm, giving nothing away. "Your entire strategy hinges on the assumption that the enemy's redundant communication network can be neutralized within the first 6 hours. What is the intelligence basis for that assumption?" It was a simple, precise question. A scalpel. I saw a flicker of panic in Cadence's eyes before he masked it. He was a good performer, but he wasn't a good analyst. "Ma'am," he stammered for a fraction of a second. "The analysis from the red cell data indicates a significant vulnerability in their infrastructure." As he said it, his eyes darted towards me for a split second. A reflexive, cowardly gesture. He was already lining up his scapegoat in case his answer was wrong. This was it. This was my moment. The opening. I raised my hand slightly. "Colonel, if I may." "Colonel." Cadence's voice cut across mine, sharp and loud. He turned his body slightly, physically blocking me from the table's line of sight. "Sergeant Cox merely provided the data support. The strategic analysis was mine. I can assure you, the conclusions are sound." He did it. He publicly silenced me. In a room full of officers, he reduced me to a piece of administrative furniture with no right to speak. The sheer, naked audacity of it sucked the air from my lungs. A tense silence descended on the room as every officer turned to look at the brazen captain and the silenced sergeant. I felt the hot flush of blood rush to my face, a familiar, sickening burn of humiliation and impotent rage. It was the academy evaluation. It was the Iron Gauntlet reprimand. It was Thanksgiving dinner. It was every single time I'd been told, in one way or another, to sit down and be quiet. My gaze shot to Rostova, a desperate, silent plea. "You saw me. You know. Do something." She looked at me. Her expression was unreadable, her ice blue eyes holding mine for a long, agonizing moment. I saw no anger on my behalf. No support. Nothing. Then she slowly turned her head back to Cadence as if I had never spoken at all. My stomach dropped. My great-aunt, a deeply religious woman, used to quote the Bible to me. Her favorite was from Psalms. "Be still in score and wait patiently," she'd say. "Fret not thyself over the one who prospers in his way." I held on to that thought like a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood. Be still. Wait. Rostova continued her questioning, each query a precise probe into the plan's weaknesses, the very weaknesses I had designed. Cadence struggled, his confident facade beginning to crack under the pressure. He fumbled for answers, falling back on vague generalities and more empty jargon to hide his lack of depth. He was tap dancing on a minefield, and I was the one who knew the location of every single mine. Finally, after an excruciating 10 minutes, Rostova stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. The tension in the room eased slightly. "Captain Thorne," she announced, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "Your plan lacks sufficient detail and is based on a number of uncorroborated assumptions. I want a full written report, including all raw data appendices and the complete analytical logs, on my desk by Aero 800, day after tomorrow." My heart leaped. The logs! She was asking for the logs. She was asking for the proof of his negligence. Then she turned her gaze on me. It was cold and hard as granite. "Sergeant Cox," she commanded, "ensure the captain has everything he needs to complete his report." The words hit me like a physical blow. It was a knife twist. Not only was I to stand by and watch this fraud continue, but I was now being ordered to actively assist him. I was to hand my enemy the tools to build his case, a case that would put American lives at risk. And her tone implied that if his report was flawed, the responsibility would now be shared. It would be my fault, too. I felt the eyes of every person in the room on me. There was only one possible answer. "Yes, Colonel," I said, my voice a dead, hollow thing. The performance was over, the curtain had fallen on Act 1, and from every angle, it looked as if I had lost. I walked back to my desk, Rostova's final order echoing in my ears. "Ensure the captain has everything he needs." It felt less like a command and more like a sentence. I could feel Cadence following close behind me, his arrogance recharged, his victory assured. He was a predator stalking a defeated prey back to its den. He followed me right into the small windowless office our team shared and slammed the door behind him. The sound was like a cell door clanging shut. "What the hell was that, Cox?" he hissed, his voice a low, furious whisper. "Were you trying to humiliate me in front of Rostova? In front of the entire command staff?" I stood my ground, turning to face him. The space was tight, and the air was suddenly thick with his anger and the cloying scent of his expensive cologne. It was the kind of smell that tries to announce wealth and power, but only succeeds in being suffocating. "I was attempting to clarify a data point, Captain," I said, my voice dangerously level. He let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Your data? Let me be perfectly clear. That is United States Army data, and right now, it serves my plan. Is that understood?" He took a step closer, invading my personal space, forcing me to tilt my head back slightly to meet his gaze. It was a classic alpha male power move, a cheap tactic. "Rostova wants her full report, so I want my full report. And when you write it, my name will be listed as the sole analyst. You were merely the compiler, the support." He moved to my desk and with a flick of his wrist, swept my half-finished can of Coke Zero aside. It clattered into the trash can, a small, insignificant act of contempt that somehow felt enormous. He placed his sleek laptop where my drink had been, claiming my workspace as his own. And that was it. That was the last straw. It was no longer just about him stealing my credit. It was no longer about his arrogance or his father's influence. This was a new, uncrossable line. He was ordering me to be a co-conspirator in his fraud, to actively falsify an official military document, to put my name, my integrity, on a lie. A lie that would be used to approve a plan so fundamentally flawed it was tantamount to a death sentence for the soldiers ordered to carry it out. In that suffocating silence, broken only by the low hum of the server racks in the corner, every injustice I had ever swallowed came rushing back. The condescending words on my academy evaluation, the stolen credit for Iron Gauntlet, the dismissive laugh at the Thanksgiving table. The two words that started it all, data entry support. They all converged into a single point of unbearable pressure right behind my eyes. I could hear my own heart, a frantic, trapped drumbeat in my chest. My gaze drifted past his shoulder to the reflection on my powered-down computer monitor. I saw a woman's face, pale and tired, cornered. And then I saw a flicker in her eyes. Not fear, not anger. It was fire. I looked at the small, perfectly folded American flag I kept on my bookshelf, the one given to me by my father when I enlisted. I thought of the oath I took, to support and defend the Constitution. I realized in that moment that defending my country sometimes meant defending it from the enemies within its own ranks, from the arrogant, the incompetent, and the corrupt. My duty wasn't to Captain Thorne. My duty was to the truth, and to the soldiers who depended on it. I took a deep, steadying breath. When I spoke, the tremor in my voice was gone. It was replaced by something else, something cold and hard as ice. "No, Captain." The word was quiet, but it landed in the small office with the force of a grenade. Cadence froze, his smug expression faltering. He looked genuinely stunned, as if the concept of defiance from someone like me was a foreign language he couldn't comprehend. "What did you just say to me?" he sputtered. I met his gaze, and I didn't flinch. I repeated the word, slowly this time, articulating every letter so there could be no misunderstanding. "I said no." I took a step forward, reclaiming the space he had stolen. "I will compile the raw data and the access logs exactly as Colonel Rostova requested. The final report will reflect the truth, that you used a curated, unvetted data set to draw dangerous and unsupported conclusions, and my name will not appear anywhere near your lie." His face went from red with anger to pale with shock, and then something else. A flicker of panic. His rage crumbled into a sputtering threat. "This is insubordination. I'll have you court-martialed, Cox." I will destroy your career. I wasn't listening anymore. The fear was gone. The pressure was gone. All that was left was a terrifying, liberating clarity. I turned my back on him, sat down at my station, and my hands flew across the keyboard. He was still ranting behind me, but his words were just meaningless noise. Right there, in front of him, I opened a new encrypted email. Recipient: Colonel Eva Rostova. Subject: Urgent request for clarification. OP: Nightfall. My fingers typed with a speed and precision I didn't know I possessed. I attached a one-page executive summary outlining the critical flaws in his plan. I attached the log files that showed he'd ignored the contradicting intelligence. I attached my original, full analysis. I looked over my shoulder at him one last time. His mouth was still moving, but his eyes were wide, fixed on my screen. He finally understood what was happening. My expression told him everything he needed to know. If you have ever been pushed to your breaking point, if you've ever had to stand up and say, "No more," give this story a like. And if you believe that integrity is more important than obedience, comment with a single word: truth. I turned back to my screen. My finger hovered over the mouse. The dam had broken, and the flood was about to begin. I clicked send. Hitting send on that email was like pulling the pin on a grenade. For a few seconds, the world was utterly silent. Cadence stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and sputtering rage. Then he bolted from the office, his phone already pressed to his ear. I didn't have to guess who he was calling. The prince was running to his king. The shockwave from my email hit the command structure faster than I expected. Less than 2 hours later, an encrypted, high-priority message from Colonel Rostova's office appeared in the inboxes of the entire senior command staff. The subject was blunt: high-security hearing regarding Operation Nightfall. The body of the message was brief and cold. A hearing was convened for 0948 hours. Both Captain Thorne and Sergeant Cox were ordered to prepare presentations and be ready to answer direct questioning. The secret war was now a publicly declared one. I felt a strange calm settle over me. One of my favorite generals, Dwight D. Eisenhower, famously said, "Plans are worthless, but planning is everything." I had no idea what the final outcome of this hearing would be, but I knew with absolute certainty that no one would be better prepared than me. The time for emotional reaction was over. It was time to work. I didn't waste a single second. I transformed my workstation into a war room, a command center for my one-woman campaign. The first order of business was to build an irrefutable fortress of evidence. I started with the server logs. I systematically retrieved every single Access file connected to Cadence Thorne and Project Chimera. I created a timeline, time-stamped to the millisecond, showing his digital footprints. I cross-referenced those timestamps with the creation dates of the sections in his draft report. The data told a damning story. Access to Red Cell File Alpha, 14 seconds. 1 minute later, the section on enemy infrastructure was written. Access to the critical contradicting intelligence report in the main directory. 0 seconds. I laid it all out, not as an accusation, but as a cold, hard sequence of facts. Next, I built what homicide detectives call a murder board, but I did it digitally. On one side of my screen, I listed every key assertion in Cadence's flawed plan. On the other, I created a web of hyperlinks, connecting each false assumption to the specific hard evidence that disproved it. The original intelligence reports he'd ignored, the time-stamped logs showing his negligence, the satellite photos he hadn't bothered to open. It was a masterpiece of organized, undeniable truth. My final exhibit was a stark comparison chart. On the left, Cadence's plan, promising a swift victory. On the right, a realistic projection based on the complete data set, showing a 40% casualty rate for our own troops within the first 4 hours. Late that afternoon, Hex appeared at the entrance to my office, a real ally this time, no pretense needed. He was holding 2 steaming paper cups of black coffee. He walked in and set one on my desk. "Heard there's gonna be fireworks," he said quietly, his eyes glancing at the complex web of data on my main monitor. He nodded at it, impressed. I reran the simulations based on Thorne's operational assumptions. Our network integrity collapses in 2 hours, not 6. The whole thing falls apart before the ground team even gets close to the target. I sent the full technical report to your secure inbox. Use it if you need it. He didn't ask what I was doing. He didn't ask if I needed help. He simply provided the ammunition. His technical report, coming from the most respected cyber warfare specialist on the base, was more than just another piece of evidence. It was a powerful endorsement from an unimpeachable expert. I looked up from my screen and gave him a grateful nod. Thanks, Hex. Give him hell, Amber, he said. And then he was gone. The quiet support of a true professional was a balm to my soul. I wasn't a lone wolf anymore. I had the truth, and I had teammates who believed in it. The next call, however, was not so friendly. My desk phone chirped, a sound I rarely heard. The caller ID was blocked, but I knew who it was before I answered. A cold, female voice, dripping with administrative authority, spoke without preamble. Sergeant Cox, General Thorne's office. He will see you now. I walked the long carpeted hallways to the command suite, my footsteps silenced by the plush wool. General Marcus Thorne's office was exactly what you'd expect. Dark wood, leather chairs, walls covered in medals, and photos of him with powerful men. It was an embassy of influence. He was sitting behind a desk the size of a car, and he did not ask me to sit down. Sergeant, he began, his voice a low rumble of practiced authority. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a king addressing a troublesome peasant. I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding regarding Operation Nightfall. My son, Captain Thorne, is a capable and dedicated officer. He let the words hang in the air. I stood at parade rest, my eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over his shoulder. It would be a shame, he continued, for a promising NCO's career to be derailed by a simple personality conflict. I strongly advise you to reconsider your allegations. For the good of the unit and for the good of your own future. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a piece of advice. It was a threat, delivered with the silken glove of absolute power. He was telling me to back down, or he would crush me. For a moment, the old fear, the old instinct to just be the support role and stay quiet, flickered inside me. Then I thought of the 40% casualty rate. I thought of the soldiers who would have to execute this flawed plan. I brought my eyes down from the wall and met his gaze directly. My voice, when I spoke, was steady and respectful, but it did not yield an inch. With all due respect, General, I said, the only thing I will be considering is the verifiable truth, and I will be presenting that truth at the hearing. I watched a storm gather in his eyes. He was not a man who was used to being told no. I held his gaze for a beat longer, then gave a sharp, professional nod. Will that be all, General? He just stared at me, momentarily speechless. I took it as a dismissal, executed a perfect about-face, and walked out of the office. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but for the first time in my life, I felt truly tall. My back had never been straighter. Just before I walked into the hearing room, I paused in the hallway and took one last, deep breath. The words of Eleanor Roosevelt echoed in my mind, a mantra I had been repeating all morning. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. Today, I was withdrawing my consent, permanently. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The room was known colloquially as the tank. It was a secure, windowless chamber deep inside the Pentagon, paneled in dark, imposing mahogany. A massive U-shaped table commanded the space, its surface polished to a dark mirror. The air was cool, still, and thick with decades of gravitas. This was a room where wars were planned and secrets were buried. A circle of power was seated at the table. Colonels I recognized, civilian experts from the DIA and NSA with faces that were all sharp intellect and tired eyes. And at the head, presiding over it all, sat Colonel Eva Rostovi. Her face was calm, her gaze steady. The ice wall. Cadence was already seated on the opposite side, looking immaculate in his Class A dress uniform, the fabric perfectly pressed, the medals on his chest gleaming under the recessed lighting. But I could see a single bead of sweat trace a path down his temple, a tiny betrayal of the panic beneath the polish. and in the observers' chairs behind the main table, a single figure sat alone: General Marcus Thorne. He didn't move or speak, but his presence was a physical weight in the room, a mountain of influence casting a long shadow. Every eye in the tank was on Cadence and me. There was no margin for error. The stage was set. Rostova began without preamble. "Captain Thorne, you may begin." Cadence stood, and the performance started. It was the same presentation he'd given before, but now it was laced with a desperate, almost pleading energy. He tried to reframe the entire conflict. This wasn't about data or strategy, he argued, but about morale and discipline. He painted a picture of me as a disgruntled, jealous subordinate, lashing out due to personal differences. He spoke of the importance of team spirit and loyalty to the chain of command, attempting to transform a hearing on professional competence into a trial of my character. This is an unfortunate attempt to undermine command authority by an individual unwilling to accept her designated role, he concluded, his voice ringing with false sincerity as he shot a challenging look in my direction. I didn't react. I just sat there, my hands resting calmly on my laptop. I let his accusations hang in the dead air, unsupported and weak. I waited. "Sergeant Cox," Rostova said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Your response." It was my turn. I didn't stand up. I didn't walk to the podium. I simply connected my laptop to the main display system with a quiet click. The massive screens on the wall flickered to life. "Colonels, gentlemen," I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified slightly by the room's acoustics. "I will not be speaking about personal opinions or team spirit. I will only be presenting the data." My desktop appeared on the screens, showing a simple, two-column layout. It was my digital murder board. On the left were the key assertions from Captain Thorne's plan. On the right were the corresponding, irrefutable facts. I moved through it with clinical precision, my voice never rising, never betraying any emotion. I was no longer a participant in the drama. I was the narrator of facts. Assertion 1. Captain Thorne's plan states that the target's communications can be disabled with a high probability of success. Here's the red cell report he cited. A document appeared on screen. The server logs, however, show this 12-page report was viewed for exactly 3.7 seconds. A collective intake of breath was audible in the room. "And here," I continued, "is the contradicting intelligence report from the main directory, which proves the target has a hardened, redundant backup system. The logs show this report was never opened by the captain at all." Point by point, I deconstructed his entire plan, not with argument, but with his own digital footprints. I showed the committee the satellite photos he hadn't viewed, the signals intelligence he had ignored, the technical analysis from Sergeant Jimenez that he had dismissed. I didn't call him a liar. I didn't call him incompetent. I just showed them the evidence of his choices laid bare for all to see. The room was utterly silent, captivated. The only sound was my own calm, steady voice. Then I brought up the final slide. It was the comparison chart. On the left, his plan. On the right, the projected outcome based on complete intelligence. My cursor hovered over the final number. The conclusion of this data indicates that if Operation Nightfall is executed as planned, it will result in an estimated 40% casualty rate among U.S. forces within the first 4 hours. A low murmur rippled through the room. This was no longer about a stolen idea. This was about the lives of soldiers. Rostova finally spoke, her voice like ice. Her gaze was locked on Cadence. "Captain Thorne, Sergeant Cox has presented a series of deeply disturbing discrepancies. Can you explain to this committee why you chose to ignore the contradicting report, file index Bravo 7? Cadence, who had been shrinking in his chair with every slide, was now completely cornered. He stammered, his polished facade crumbling into dust. I had to make a command decision based on the overall picture, ma'am. I deemed that report to be unreliable." Rostova leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Unreliable? Is that your testimony, Captain?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's fascinating," Rostova said, her voice dropping, becoming lethally quiet. "Because I wrote that report myself. 3 years ago, when I was commanding a forward operating base in that exact sector. She let the words land. They detonated in the silent room. So please, Captain, she continued, her voice dripping with contempt. Enlighten me. What in your vast combat experience led you to determine that my analysis was unreliable? Checkmate, it was the kill shot. The room was plunged into a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. Cadence visibly deflated, collapsing back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was broken. Every eye in that room, which had once looked at him with admiration, was now filled with a mixture of shock and utter disdain. In the back of the room, I saw General Thorne slowly, deliberately, close his eyes. The game was over. The silence that followed Cadence's implosion was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a vacuum, filled with the wreckage of a career, the weight of a father's shame, and the stark, unassailable presence of the truth. The hearing didn't end with a gavel or a formal dismissal, it simply dissolved. Two stone-faced military police officers materialized and quietly escorted a pale, hollowed-out Cadence Thorne from the room. He never looked at me. General Thorne rose slowly, a man who seemed to have aged a decade in the last 10 minutes. He gathered his dignity around him like a heavy cloak and walked out without a word. The other officers filed out after him, their faces a mixture of shock and quiet respect, avoiding my gaze as if I were now something other, something more dangerous than just a sergeant. Soon, only Colonel Rostova and I remained in the tank. There were no congratulations, no back-patting, just a formal, professional quiet. The adrenaline that had sustained me for the past 48 hours drained away all at once, leaving a profound, bone-weary exhaustion in its place. The tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders for weeks, for years, finally released its grip. I had won. But it didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like the end of a long, debilitating fever. There was no joy, only a vast, empty relief that the nightmare was over. I didn't go to the mess hall or go for a drink with Hex. I went back to my quiet office, the one where the war had officially been declared, and I put the kettle on. As I waited for the water to boil, I thought of a quote by Abraham Lincoln I'd once read. I am a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts. I had brought the facts, and the system, in the form of one incorruptible colonel, had worked. This victory wasn't sweet, but it was necessary. Rostova appeared at my door a few minutes later, her metal mug in hand. She watched me prepare my tea for a moment before speaking. Sergeant, she said, her voice cutting through my thoughts, we still have an imminent threat, and we are now without an operational plan for nightfall. What do you have? There was no preamble, no acknowledgement of the drama that had just unfolded, just the mission. I respected her for that more than I could say. I took a breath, my exhaustion momentarily forgotten, my professionalism kicking back in. I sat down at my terminal and opened a different file, one labeled OP Nightfall Contingency. I do, Colonel, I said. I presented my plan, the real plan, the one built on the complete, unvarnished data set. It wasn't flashy. It didn't promise a swift, glorious victory. It was a cautious, methodical, and realistic plan that prioritized the lives of our soldiers above all else. It was a plan built on intel, not ego. Rostova listened intently, her eyes following every data point on the screen. She didn't interrupt, but I saw her give a few small, sharp nods of approval. When I finished, she was silent for a moment, her gaze distant as she processed the information. Then she looked at me, her decision made. Get it done, she said, her voice firm. You have full authority over the analytic team for this operation. Report directly to me. Full authority. Reporting directly to her. In the space of a single sentence, she had shattered the box they had tried to put me in for my entire career. I was no longer support. I was in command. Yes, Colonel, was all I could manage to say. A few days later, I received another summons, this one from General Thorne. I walked back to that same plush office, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The intimidating power was gone, replaced by a heavy sense of sorrow. He looked tired, defeated. He gestured for me to sit, and this time, I did. "My son was wrong," he began, his voice hoarse, the words clearly costing him. "He disgraced the uniform. He put lives at risk for his own vanity." He paused, looking at his hands, which rested on his clean desk. And I, as his father and as his commanding officer, failed to see it. Or refused to. He finally looked up and met my eyes. "You are a good soldier, Sergeant Cox. You did the right thing when it was the hard thing to do." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was a profound admission. It was the closing of a chapter. "I was just doing my duty, General," I said quietly. There was nothing else to say. When I returned to my office, I felt a shift inside me. The personal fight was over. Now, a different kind of work began. The problem wasn't just Cadence Thorne. It was a system that allowed a man like him to rise to a position where his ego could become a weapon. My first act with my new authority was not to plan a mission, but to draft a new protocol. I called it the Mandatory Intelligence Verification and Cross-Reference Protocol. It was a simple, one-page document with a clear, unbreakable rule. From now on, no operational plan could be submitted to command without being signed off on by at least 2 independent analysts. Furthermore, the full, raw data set from which the conclusions were drawn had to be included as a standard appendix. No more cherry-picking, no more curated realities. I sent the draft to Colonel Rostova. Less than an hour later, it came back with a single word in the body of the email. Approved. By the end of the day, it was official policy, disseminated to the entire Intelligence Directorate. As I looked at the new directive on my screen, I realized what this was all about. This wasn't my victory over Cadence. This was my legacy. I wasn't tearing something down. I was building something new. I was building a wall. Not a wall to keep people out, but a firewall to protect the truth. A structural boundary to ensure that no one else, no matter how ambitious or well-connected, could ever again gamble with the lives of soldiers for the sake of their own glory. The silence was over. The new work had just begun. 6 months later, the landscape at Fort Meade had fundamentally changed. The aftershocks of the hearing had reshaped careers and rewritten protocols. Cadence Thorne, after a quiet and efficient court-martial, was dishonorably discharged from the Army, his promising career reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in the hallways. Not long after, General Marcus Thorne submitted his papers for an early retirement, fading from the world of command with a quiet dignity that belied his family's public disgrace. In their place, something new had been built. My protocol, the one I had drafted in the quiet aftermath of my victory, had evolved. With Colonel Rostova's backing, it became the charter for a new independent unit, the Command Intelligence Verification Authority, or CVA. We weren't a command unit. We didn't make the final decisions. We were something far more important. We were the gatekeepers of the truth. No major operational plan went to the top without first passing through our rigorous, unbiased analysis. The nickname they once gave Rostova, the Ice Wall, was now affectionately, and sometimes fearfully, applied to my entire team. The Army, in its own way, recognized the shift. The promotion list came out, and my name was on it. I was now Sergeant First Class Cox, but the new stripes on my sleeve were far less important than the change that had taken place inside me. I had found my own definition of leadership, and it looked nothing like the top-down, fear-based authority I'd fought against. My office door was always open. I led not by giving orders, but by asking questions, by listening, by empowering the brilliant young soldiers on my team, the sergeants, specialists, and even the fresh-faced privates straight from training, to challenge assumptions, including my own. If you have the data to back it up, I told them, then your voice matters in this room. It didn't matter if you were a private or a major. We were building the one thing I'd always craved, a true meritocracy. A place where the quality of your work, not the rank on your collar, was the only currency that mattered. On my desk, taped to the bottom of my monitor, is a small post-it note. On it, I've written 3 words that have become the guiding principle of my unit, my personal constitution. Data has no rank. One afternoon, my desk phone rang with an unfamiliar extension. I answered, and a man's voice, clear and confident, came on the line. "Sergeant First Class Cox?" he asked. "Speaking," I replied. "Ma'am, you probably don't remember me. My name is Captain Miller. A few years ago, I was a lieutenant in the Korengal Valley." The name stopped me cold. Korengal. The ambush. The report they ignored. "I remember, Captain," I said, my voice softer now. "I know," he said. "Well, the military grapevine is a funny thing. We heard about what you did, what you're doing now with Siva. A bunch of us who were there that day, we were talking. I was just elected to call and say thank you. Not just for saving our hides back then, but for the fight you're fighting now. You're fighting a different kind of war for all of us, Sergeant, and we're grateful." I sat there for a long moment after he hung up, unable to speak. My eyes stung. That single, unexpected phone call meant more to me than any promotion, any medal, any official commendation ever could. It was the confirmation I never knew I needed. My fight hadn't just been for myself, it had been for them. For all the soldiers in the field who trust us, implicitly, to give them the truth. The story ends here, but my work doesn't. It ends with me this afternoon. Not in my office, but in one of the small training rooms down the hall. I'm with the newest batch of analysts, 6 of them, their faces bright with intelligence and a touch of nervous energy. They remind me of myself, all those years ago. We're gathered around a central table, not a podium in sight. On the main screen is a complex signals intelligence problem, and we're working through it together. A young specialist, a woman named Diaz, points to an anomaly on the screen. "Sergeant First Class," she says, her voice hesitant. "The official report says this is just atmospheric distortion, but it doesn't look like it. The pattern is too regular." I look at the data, and then I look at her. I don't give her the answer. I ask a question. "What does your data tell you, specialist?" I see her sit up a little straighter, her confidence growing. "My data tells me it's a low-frequency signal, ma'am. Deliberately masked." I smile. Then that's the truth we follow. I look around the table at these sharp, dedicated young soldiers. These future gatekeepers. They are learning more than just how to analyze data. They are learning that their voice matters, that integrity is their sharpest weapon, and that their ultimate duty is to the facts, no matter how inconvenient they may be. "Remember this," I tell them, my voice quiet but carrying in the small room. "Our greatest weapon isn't a rifle or a drone, it's the truth. Data has no rank, it has no loyalty. And it doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It tells you what you need to hear. Our job is to listen, and to make sure its voice is heard, no matter how powerful the person who wants to silence it." I look at their faces, and I see the future. And for the first time in a very long time, I am filled with an unshakable sense of hope. The long night was over. A new dawn had finally come to Fort Meade. That's where my story is today. It isn't over because this work is never truly over. The fight for truth isn't a single battle. It's a constant daily vigilance. It's a choice that I and people like my team make every single morning. The greatest lesson I learned is that one voice, armed with the truth, is more powerful than a room full of rank. My story isn't just about the military. It's for anyone who has ever been silenced, overlooked, or told to just do their job and not to think. If this story resonated with you, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like mine that need to be told. Stories of quiet courage that deserve to be heard. And please, share this with anyone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters. Because it does. Thank you for listening.